Hello guys and welcome to Total War Shogun 2. Today I want to talk to you about the units of the Rise of the Samurai DLC expansion. This one is nice and simple compared to the base game, so let's get into it. To start, we have our general units. Now, what is a general unit type? This is the guy that usually you'll put at the head of your army. If you're playing the campaign, your army doesn't really necessarily have to have a general, but it's good to have one. They come with buffs that are not really displayed here, but they do come with buffs that can help your other units, such as rallying them when their morale drops, such as bolstering their combat abilities. Even just being near the general is a boon. Their actual combat values are not very good. The actual stats here are not the worst. And in Rise of the Samurai, we could see here our general's bodyguard accompanying the general actually has some range capacity, which is pretty great. But there's only 40 of them total. They are squishy. They have a little bit more function than the generals in the base game, but they are still something that you want to keep out of combat, more so than other Total Wars, especially newer ones. Next, we're going to skip down to sword infantry. Let's consider this for Rise of the Samurai, our base kind of infantry, the sword infantry. And here we have sword attendants. This is equivalent to a samurai unit from the base game. Attendance equals samurai, basically, essentially. And then there's a hero type unit as well. Anything hero or heroine, that is just a special hero type, kind of like the general. It has similar capabilities. It is appropriately expensive to have in addition to a general, but there is going to be less of the actual units in the total, 100 versus 20 right here. You could compare the stats. You see this is way better, but there's 1/5 of them. So realistically, monk heroes fighting one or two sword attendants might actually just get wiped out. I mean, if you wanted to spend the same amount of money, you would have two sword attendants and a general providing buffs that would slaughter a monk hero. So you got to use these guys as kind of like proxies to the general, providing other buffs and supporting units in combat with special abilities and high stats, not actually using them by themselves. But the attendants, the samurai, this is your main strong type of units, and swords are your main melee infantry versus infantry type of units. Swords in the base game would be katanas. You have higher melee attack, and you do not really have any resistance to cavalry. If you are bringing sword attendants, just note their weakness. They are weak to being charged, especially by cavalry, though they are decent at charging themselves. Swords against swords is the ideal situation, especially if supported by buffs from heroes or generals, or from cavalry flanking enemies in the rear, which we'll talk about in a bit. But who's the other type of infantry we'd be fighting? Well, that would be spear infantry. Going up here, we have Naginata attendants, equivalent to Naginata samurai from the base game. This is a type of infantry unit that is not quite the opposite of a sword unit, of a katana. This is similar, as close as you can get, while actually maintaining a spear, the Naginata being a sort of staff with a blade at the end of it. You do have a bonus versus cavalry, so you can hold your own. You won't be able to have as much of a charge bonus, which is kind of funny if you think about it. But if you do compare the stats, you'll see the Naginata's melee attack is way worse, but they are better at defending, and they do have a little bit more armor to protect them in melee and from enemy range. Their morale, otherwise, is similar. In the base game, there are Yari as well, which are true spearmen. Those do not exist in our roster here. You will not really get to use those here. This is why I say this is so much simpler. We're getting rid of a unit type. You either have the raw melee infantry versus infantry, or you have infantry that just gives up a little bit of capability to defend better, to hold the line, and especially to counteract cavalry. Then we can look a little bit of a difference here. We have the warrior monks, which are just generally more expensive here, and it goes up to the warrior monk hero. Now, the relationship here is a bit different than the base game. In here, we have pretty much a direct upgrade. As you can see, the stats get much, much better. You're now paying more than a sword attendant, but you are getting equivalent melee attack values, but much better defense. And you get the defense against cavalry as well. These guys are pretty good. Of course, in the campaign, you're going to have to unlock them, and that's why they are so good. Even their warrior monk hero is more expensive for a good reason. But then we have the levy unit. Now, if you played the base game, you'll know this as the Ashigaru unit. This is your worse than samurai, your worse than attendant type of unit. The stats are god-awful. It is what you pick instead of attendants if you cannot afford them or you do not have them unlocked. When you need cheap, mass-produced units that come with higher quantities that can maybe be supported by the generals or by heroes or something, for example. When the quality approach doesn't work, but truly in Rise of the Samurai, the quality warrior monks here definitely reign supreme. Now, as we scroll down, we have another interesting situation with bow infantry. So, to cover, we have the bow levies. These are your weaker versions of the attendants, which, as we can see, you'll also have more units, more arrows flying in any one direction. That helps with the lowered, halved, by the way, accuracy, but you don't get twice the arrows. You get 1.5 times the normal arrows. These are to fire at a range, the same range that general can fire at. Do not fire over your own units into the enemy. You will shoot your own units in the back in addition to the enemy. If you shoot into the backs of the enemies, you might still hit your units if they are engaged in a melee. Ideally, you will be firing at enemy skirmishers, or you will be firing at enemy melee units, cavalry, that are simply not engaged in combat. That is the ideal situation. Attendants obviously better than levies, and then as per Rise of Samurai logic, the warrior monk version is just better. Plain and simple. But then it changes things up here. With the foot samurai, as you can see, you get a lot more accuracy and reload skill. But you're losing out some of this morale. But all your other stats go up. Generally an improvement, except you also get less unit strength with every upgrade. You know, we go from levies to the attendants and the warrior monks. We're down to 80. Now we're down to 60 with the foot samurai. More quality over quantity. Rise of the Samurai has a lot of these, units that will stick out and be better with no real reason or comparison to the base game. Whatever you know about warrior monks from the base game, just leave that in the past. It's a more linear and direct approach here, for sure. So look at this as linearly as possible. More money usually equals better, and probably better to have in general, except for heroes. It will never mean that for heroes. So now to cavalry, there's only really 2 cavalry units here. We have the mounted Naginata and the mounted samurai, which, as you can guess, would be pretty similar to their counterparts. The mounted Naginata in combat is going to be using their Naginata, their spears. These are your shock cavalry. These are the closest thing to your Yari cavalry. The mounted samurai, notice it's not like sword, right? These do have the swords, but they also have bows. So they took the katana cavalry and combined it with the bow cavalry into one mounted samurai. And it costs more to reflect that. Then we just have 2 heroes, which we've already discussed what that's like. So between these, you would have your standard shock cavalry charge in someone's rear, move out the back, and then charge in again, ideally, or charge in and try to help their morale decrease at like the end of their life, for example. Or we have the mounted samurai, which takes the strengths and weaknesses of its previous counterparts that have merged together to form it, where it's going to do great in range. Fair enough, great accuracy, of course, but there's just not that many of them. It's going to do great in melee, but its defense is lower in melee. It does have more armor to resist enemy bows, but also it will help in melee as well. This can function in a prolonged melee fight, but not as well as a katana samurai from the base game. No. Generally for melee, your mounted Naginata will be the way, and the mounted samurai can do it. Very versatile in that nature. But it just depends if you want the specialty or the versatility. And then finally, we have the stealth and siege units, which has been narrowed down simply to very basic firebomb throwers. There are barely anyone in these stacks. These are no rockets. Certainly, their range is minimal. Bows could slaughter these guys from afar. You simply want to use these kinda cheap units. They're a little pricey at the same time to throw a bunch of bombs at someone unsuspecting. Ideally, from behind and not from the sides, including your own troops. Head on is dangerous with a range like this. You'd have to really specialize to use these very well. And just like that, nice, quick, and easy, much easier than the base game. We've covered all of Rise of the Samurai. If you have any questions that I haven't quite answered, feel free to ask those in the comments below. If you have any suggestions for guides that I haven't already made in the playlist in the description below, feel free to leave suggestions for that in the comments below as well. I hope you found this guide helpful. I will also make one of these for Fall of the Samurai, which is going to be a lot different. For now, though, thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.